All right, here we go. That's me. Welcome, everybody. Hello. Better Spaces is a health and happiness solution for today's hybrid workplace. My name is Dr. Paul Cachoa with PAR5 Physical Therapy here in Randolph, New Jersey, and I partnered with them to give you this easy and educational workday session. So today's session is called Hip Hinge Mastery, the key to lifting, playing, and protecting your spine, right? So we're going to learn, let me make this a little bit bigger. We're going to learn why the hip hinge is one of the most important movement patterns for protecting the back and powering sports like golf and pickleball, and even everyday activities like picking up your laundry. So you'll learn the correct techniques for hinging, bending, and lifting safely. So a little bit about me. I got my doctorate from Mercer University in upstate Dobbs Ferry, New York. And I've been a PT for, I don't know, over 25 years now. I've got an exercise physiology degree from Rutgers University. I'm a certified orthopedic, board certified orthopedic clinical specialist, certified dry needling specialist, certified golf medical professional, golf fitness trainer, and also a level 1 certified CrossFit coach. So if there's anything that, I want to make this session as helpful and informative as possible. So please use the chat and let's get started. I'm going to pull up my slides here. Well, here we go. Yeah, I told you my thing was like frozen, and now we've got a little bit of this slow CPU. So you can see how I'm moving really slow. So it's so weird. Anyway, let's try and get through this with hip hinge mastery. Let's see if I can just kind of pop this open. I think that's a little bit better, right? You could see that. And let's see if we can go back. Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like it. Anyway, I'm going to see what I can do on my end while I'm talking. But anyway, this is basically what we're talking about here. Now, make sure that one, you listen to this slide, because basically, because I'm a medical professional, you have to pay attention, because if you're dealing with something specific, make sure that you get your, oops, missed things, slides went away. Anyway, if you're dealing with something specific, make sure that you get your thorough physical exam, because the one thing is that the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is very broad, and it's aimed at aimed at a broad population. So I'm just going to put myself in here. Let's see if I can pop this in, and if this works. Wow, there I am, active, on the fly, changing, so you can see my face as we get through these slides, huh? How about that? How about that technology? All right, so anyway, let's get into it. So the other thing to remember is that, you want to go through these positions and exercises as gently as possible and make them and do them frequently, right? Because your body ultimately adapts to the positions you put them in. So there should never be pain when you're doing an exercise or a drill, because there's an infinitesimal number of ways that you can scale or change an exercise to make it effective, have the correct stimulus without causing any discomfort or pain. All right. Now, if you've been to any of my classes, this is one of the slides that's super important. You've probably seen it before. And ultimately, it is how the body functions. The body functions on this alternating pattern of stability and mobility. If this pattern is disrupted, then pain or injury is usually the result. So if we look at this whole thing, we're looking at the stable segments of the foot, knee, lower back, scapula, elbow, and the mobile segments. We start from the bottom. The foot needs to be a stable segment, right? And then the ankle needs to be a mobile segment, and then, so on and so forth, up and down the chain. So it's super important that when we're dealing with the body and trying to fix things that need fixing, we have to look upstream and downstream, because if what tends to happen is that our body adapts and can reverse the role of certain body parts. If, for example, our lower back, right? Our lower back and our hip, where those things are connected, our lower back is supposed to be a stable segment, our core, right? And if the hips or the thoracic spine, which is the segment above and below, If they are stiff, if they're not mobile, then our body basically reverses the roles, where you have a stiff thoracic spine or a stiff hip, it becomes stable, and then the lower back becomes a mobile segment. So it reverses the role, and bad things happen. All right. So next thing, you probably have heard about these body mechanic terms, or these cues for body mechanics with, lift with your legs, or bend your knees, or keep your back straight. And those are very common things that people say all the time. But one of the things is, like, how do we do this properly to get something off the floor or get into an athletic position without causing back pain? The key is this, these muscles right here. So the muscles that you could see down into this section here, I'm pointing at them, yeah, my little square, the muscles of the hip, the glutes, right? So you have the glute maximus, the glute medius, and then the smaller ones, the glute minimus, and all the other smaller ones around the hip joint. So let me go over here, and you can probably see my mouse. There it is, awesome. All these muscles over here essentially are smaller muscles that function like a rotator cuff around the hip, all right? So the shoulder, another ball and socket joint, is like the hip. The rotator cuff, the shoulder has a rotator cuff, the hip has a rotator cuff. That's all those smaller muscles on this side. Here it is. There's my cursor. Now, the glute maximus, glute medius are super important for creating power because they can protect your lower back and your knees. If you have weak glutes, then chances are you probably have a tight back or painful back or problems with your knees. All right. So there's this thing called athletic posture. Whenever I'm coaching somebody, I say, hey, can you get into an athletic posture? And typically it looks like this. It looks like, feet about shoulder width apart and the hips go back, So essentially we get into this very stable position of a hip hinge, right? We can define that and talk a lot more about that. But you can see all these sports figures here in this athletic posture, right? And then, when we're coaching, doing some type of drills in the on the court, we're trying to stay in this athletic posture. And if you play tennis or pickleball, these are the positions that you'll get into when you're trying to hit balls, right? Center balance, the hips are back, and the spine is neutral. One of the things that I always see in golfers, right? This is one setup at the address position. The left-hand side person, you can see how they're hunched over. And then the right-hand person over here is a better posture. Their spine is neutral, and that's our hip hinge pattern that we want to get into. And the hinge is a very hip dominant exercise, and the squat is a very knee dominant exercise. So when you're trying to go down and pick something up off the ground, these are two different strategies to solve that movement problem. Okay, you could spot the difference here and how in the hip dominant, the hips are above the knees versus the knee dominant, the hips are below the knees. And by the way, the squat that's pictured here is a functional, anatomically correct squat. Oftentimes, as we age, we lose the ability to perform this squat. Why? Because for the majority of our life, we never bend our knees or our hips past 90 degrees. We spend so much time in chairs and couches, and we lose the ability that we were born to do. All right. So I will say this is that you look at any toddler, any person who has not yet gone to school, right? 5 and under, when they play, they can get into this squat. And because our body adapts to the positions that we put it in, majority of this time that we're never in this squat, we lose it. We are unable to attain this position. And we look at different cultures and we could see that this is their position of rest. They can get into this position even in their geriatric years because they do not spend time sitting 80 to 90% of the day and with 90-degree angles at their knees and hips. So if you don't use it, you will lose it. All right. And this is another fault that I see with hip hinging, where the spine, let me see if I can move my little picture head out of the way. There you go. Where the spine does not remain neutral. So there's a cursor, my arrow. This is a neutral spine, and this is rounded. When people have a poor sense of what their spine is supposed to look like or control. And then all of a sudden they're like, hey, you know what? I am hinging, but my back is not straight. So this is another cue that we could talk about. We'll show this in a moment using a PVC pipe to maintain a stable back and a neutral spine. All right, so let's talk about this hip hinge position progression. So let me pull up my 2-shot here, and hopefully the CPU and my computer is working fine. You can see my movements were not jerky. Okay, cool. So now we're gonna grab a broomstick. It doesn't matter what it is. If you've been to my other classes, we talk a lot about posture and what is perfect posture. There is no such thing as posture, but we need a vertical surface as a reference point for what our posture could be. So other classes, I've talked about, standing up against the wall. You should be able to get your hips, shoulders, and head against the wall without lifting your head up or having your back arch dramatically away from the wall. So I have my stick. Hopefully you can see me in the camera here. I get my hand behind and I'm holding. Let's turn around this way. Is that better? Or is this better? There you go, that's better. So if I stand here and I give you this, my side view, right? I've got my stick touching my head. My head is neutral, all right? I don't want to touch my head like this where I'm looking up, my chin is up. I want to keep my chin down. Head touching, between my shoulder blades are touching, and then my butt, my sacrum, my pelvis is touching. So all of those points are touching the stick, and this is what we want to do. We want to hold at this middle lower back area because of the natural curve of your spine. There is a space for you to hold your stick, right? So this is your reference point for what's vertical, what's what's our posture when we stand up? Could we get into these positions? If you can't, that probably signals that you got to work on it or do something or see a professional to try and get your spine straight. Now, how do we do the hip hinge? So with the hip hinge, what I'll do is I'll get my feet about hip width apart and make sure both of my feet are pointed straight, okay? And I've got my stick as my reference point. I want to keep my head between my shoulder blades and my pelvis touching, and I'm just going to hinge forward, right? My knees stay over the ankles. My knees do not go forward of my toes. My weight stays in the middle of my feet and my hips go back. So from this angle, let me turn around, show you this one. There we go. Let's get the side view. All right. Hopefully we got it. Good. Side view. I'm going to go hips back. Hips stay in contact. Middle part of my back stays in contact. My head stays in contact. And this is a hip hinge. You could see my shins are vertical. My knees do not go forward. Okay, so essentially this is the basis of the movement, right? So if I get rid of that, right? And I'm facing here, we talked about how the lower back needs to be stable, right? This is our core. And we think about this core as like this, girdle that wraps around like a back brace or something like that. That, in other classes, we talk about a two-handed rule. When I am moving, picking stuff up or doing something athletic, we want to, at the very least, try and keep two hands, one at my pubic bone and one at my sternum, and prevent them from coming together or coming apart. All right? Because if those two hands come together or come apart, that creates that unstable lower back or a change in our spine angle, right? So the two-handed rule. So if I think about activating my abdominals, right? The deep transverse abdominis is the one muscle that everyone needs to be able to control and stabilize. That creates some tension and wraps around, that muscle wraps around like a girdle and stabilizes my spine. And then there's the lat muscle. The latissimus muscle is a muscle that goes from, let me just admit this person from the waiting room. Good. The lat muscle comes from the shoulder, right? Actually, it starts on your lower back, rides up, and then goes into the front part of the arm. The lat muscle is a big muscle of the back that can also stabilize and take the pressure off your back if used properly in this hip hinge movement mechanic. So, without this, I want to make sure that this stays stable. Let me see here if I could mute people. Awesome. Thank you. And one, we want to get our feet about hip width apart, send our hips back. My shin stays vertical, right? My knees do not move forward. So my first move is not knees forward, because if my knees go forward, my hip is muted, what we call muted, and my spine is straight, sure, but I'm not really getting any movement or hip hinging activity here through here. So I want to get this first. I stick my butt out, my spine stays neutral, activate my abdominals to take away some of the pressure on my back, and then we can go into this hip hinge. So one other way to cue this, let me just get a foam roller right here. One sec. All right, close that door and get back here. So, this is a ubiquitous type of fitness tool that you could probably pick this up anywhere. It's a foam roller. If I set this right in front of my thighs, hopefully you can kind of see how that's set up there. And I put my hands like this. So I'm not holding on to it. I just want to keep my arms straight and compress this. Let me see if I can get into the mirror too, so you can see. So I compress this against my hips, my thighs, and then if I allow this to roll down and then go to my knees, that helps to cue my lat muscle, my latissimus muscle, and activate that to stabilize my spine into this hip hinge position. All right, so that's another little cue that we do. So I push, I try and squeeze this with the sides of my hand, pinky side of my hand, and I send my hips back. And then I don't let my knees go forward. And I generally go to where this goes above the knees. My arms will remain straight. And I come back up. So this is the hip hinge, right? So once we could do this and kind of feel that out, get that movement mechanic, we could put that away as a cue mechanism, and then just kind of do it with our hands on our thighs. So let me give you a different angle here, and just kind of send the thigh or send the hands down the thighs, maybe touch the shin. Could check in the mirror, is my spine straight, my head straight? I'm not like this, or I'm extending too much, or not like this, or I'm rounding. I want to be neutral, just like that PVC pipe, that stick that we put on the back of the head and down the spine. And I have to repeat this a couple times, all right? And see if I am comfortable in this position, all right? So if we think about athletic posture, I'm ready to run, jump, sidestep, whatever. I am here with my feet balanced, hips back, core engaged, and my spine neutral, right? So this is how we can play and be functional. Now, when it comes to lifting something up off the ground, let's just say, let me grab this bag. This bag weighs 22 pounds. We could do the same thing that we did before. Activate the lats, right? Which pull objects closer to us, right? So the lat muscle, all that does is just kind of extend the shoulder like this, but also because it inserts into the lower back, helps to relieve some of that pressure off your lower back and stabilize it as well. So anything, if I'm going to pick up off the ground, I want to make sure it's closer to my center of gravity. The closer it is, the relatively lighter it is, the less torque it is on my back, on my core. Trying to pick something up from here away is much harder. Just like if you hold a weight out in front like this is much harder than holding it close to you. So I'm going to get as close as possible and get into my hip hinge maneuver. Hips go back, spine stays neutral, core is engaged, and I'm going to grasp this and then pull my shoulders back, just like we did with the foam roll. And what that does is activate those lat muscles and keeps the weight close. And then I could stand up. And I could certainly, with this stable movement here, if I practice this, I could progress with heavier and heavier weights with less and less back pain. So I think in the long term, if you want to have a good health span and not just a good lifespan, we want to be able to master that hip hinge so we take away some of that stress. And we could think about even transferring that to everyday activities like getting up out of a chair, to maybe relieve some back pain or knee pain. When I go to sit, that's essentially the same thing as a hip hinge. I'm hinging at the hip and I come up. Fun party trick, I'm going to tell you this right now, is that wherever you go, when you stand up out of a chair, you cannot stand up unless you accomplish shifting your center of gravity over your feet, which means that your head and shoulders have to come forward. It is impossible for someone to stand up without bringing their head over their toes, all right? Without using the arms. I mean, you could certainly do this and then stand up if you had armrests, but you wouldn't fully stand up unless those armrests were very, very high. So fun party trick. You go, you're in the holidays, Thanksgiving dinner, whatever holiday dinner, and you pick the biggest person in the room, right? You have them sit down in a chair, and then you bet them $5 that you can keep them in that chair using your pinky. And that's it. And they're like, all right, fine, cool. I'll take that bet, right? So all you do is you have them sit in the chair, you put your pinky right on their forehead like this, and just about maybe 2 pounds of pressure, they cannot go forward because you're holding their head back with your pinky. They cannot stand up. It's impossible. You could try that on your own. All righty. So that's it. So then we've got that core activation we talked about, just kind of reviewing things in my little thing. Oh, and we could also progress. The next progression is doing the same hip hinge pattern in a unilateral or single-legged version. So this variation is basically the same thing that we did before, like this, except I take it onto one leg and I raise the other leg back, matching the angle of my trunk, right? So if my trunk moves forward at a certain angle, 45 degrees, my leg is going to go in the opposite direction at 45 degrees approximately, all right? So that's a single-legged hip hinge. We can kind of do that. I like doing single-legged exercises if you're looking to strengthen, but you don't have a lot of weight or you want to take the stress off of your spine. You can get the same stimulus and workout if we did a single-legged hip hinge with a weight, right? Holding a weight here. But because we're only using one leg, there's a lot of different systems that are involved, your balance, and all the weight is on one leg, which increases the intensity. Versus if we did it two-legged, like a regular hip hinge like this or a deadlift, we'd have to use more weight to use more weight to have the same stimulus. And then with more weight doing that repeatedly, that kind of can put pressure on your back if done incorrectly. All righty. So that's a quick little thing about the hip hinge. All right, let me see here. See if there's any questions going on. I don't even know if my window is up for the chat. There it is. Okay. Question. Yes. I have noticed when my hips are tight and stiff, my back hurts much more. Is that typical? I would say yes, right? Because again, like our video that we showed earlier about the alternating pattern of stability and mobility, if this pattern is disrupted, then pain or injury is the result. So that theme of, hey, if your hips are tight and stiff, the hips are supposed to be mobile, all right? If your hips are tight and stiff, the next segment up, which is your lumbar spine, your core, that's supposed to be stable. So then your body's like, hey, I've lost range of motion or mobility in my mobile segment. That's locked into a stable segment. The next segment up is going to be the lower back. That's your body says, all right, reflexively, I'm going to make that a mobile segment. And then your back does more mobility and it's unstable. And the other thing, vice versa, can work downstream as well, that your knee can become unstable even though it's supposed to be stable. So that's another thing that can happen when you have tight hips. All right, there's another question. Somebody has asked, can you discuss the differences between men and women's hips and their center of gravity? Yes. So in general, men have a narrow and more taller pelvis, right? And their hips and legs come out at a different angle. And for women, they have a flatter, wider pelvis. Now, the most important thing that happens is this angle that happens. If you have like, you could, I don't even have a video. Oh, let me see if I could pull this up real quick. If you look at the hip, I think there was a little picture of this. Good. Here we are. Let's look at this real quick. So this part right here, it's hard to see underneath all this meat and muscle, but the pelvis has a socket in there. And the socket has like a neck where the ball goes into the socket, right? So the ball, and there's a neck, and then the femur goes down, all right? So keep that in mind as we go back to here, and we'll talk about what that means. So you have your pelvis, right? and then the hip has like this neck, and that ball goes into the socket of the neck, right? And then the femur goes down. This angle changes for women and men. Usually it's 135 degrees. As we age, it decreases. But lying on your back, whoop, there's also this angle. And this is the biggest difference between males and females. This angle, which we call the angle of version, V-E-R-S-I-O-N, is what determines what your stance is like, what direction do your knees point, what direction do your feet point. Depending upon this angle, and you can certainly measure that in the clinic, that determines what your ideal position is for your hip width, your position of your feet, and etc. So those are the differences. And I guess the center of gravity, I mean, I guess mostly, and this is a generalization, that women have a slightly lower center of gravity versus men have a higher center of gravity just because of muscle mass and adipose tissue distribution. All right. Why? Another question. Why do my hips click when exercising? It isn't painful, just very annoying. And I will say yes. All right, so joints in our body, especially ball and socket joints, sometimes the hinge joints like the knee and the elbow, they're moving, right? And these joints are lined with cartilage at the end so that when they move, they should be smooth, right? But as we age, what happens? There's a degeneration of that cartilage, which may or may not cause pain. Pain is independent of degeneration of joints, right? You could have a lot of degeneration and have no pain, or have a little bit of degeneration and have a lot of pain, all right? So keep that in mind. Now, the noise that happens in a joint as it moves can be due to a lot of different things. One, most common things, right, I would say this, is tendons or ligaments, which are structures that connect muscle to bone, tendon, and connecting bone to bone, that's a ligament. Tendons or ligaments, as they roll over a bony bump, right? So you can think about the ends of bones are not smooth. They have like bumps which attach muscle, right? So you think about the hip or the shoulder, you know, with the rotator cuff and all that stuff, holding that ball and socket in place. It's moving around, it's mobile, and you've got bumps on these bones which can, you know, roll under a taut tendon or a muscle that's flexed. Sometimes that can cause noise. What could also cause noise is the surfaces of these joints, these cartilage, as they are, they're not smooth. Sometimes they get little pits, and like when you're driving over a gravelly road, you can get the noise as the joint surfaces slide. Another thing that can cause joint noise is all the joints are held together with a sac, a capsule, right? And this capsule is airtight, and sometimes gas can be formed inside the capsule. And as you move, these gas pockets pop. And that can create noise too. Imagine, like, you know, cracking your knuckles. All right, it's sort of like a plunger. If you plunge a toilet, create that suction, and then pull it back quickly, it's like a pop. When you crack knuckles, that's what basically creates that noise, that cavitation. So is that something? What does that mean? Well, if you have noise in a joint and there is, one, no pain associated with the noise, and two, the joint does not lock and unlock when the noise happens, then you're good. Nothing to worry about, because our bodies change over the years, noise happens in joints, and that's very normal. If there is pain with the noise, or there is a locking sensation, then I would have that assessed, because there's some bony blocks or some other type of cartilage that could be stuck in the joint, and then you have to unstick it, and that creates a noise and pain at the same time. All right, so hopefully all of that. Any other questions? Hopefully that answered all of your questions today. I probably need to update my computer, get a new computer to have my cameras work at one time instead of having a lot of slowing down of my CPU. All right, anyway, that's it for me. I'm going to give it a 30-second countdown and make sure I've addressed everybody's questions. You're welcome. And we'll close it out today. And I want to thank you, everyone, for coming to join me today. You could look for this session and many more on demand on any of the Better Spaces apps. So I'll be back Tuesday, November 25th. Tuesday, November 25th, we're going to be doing shoulder and upper back resilience, avoiding cold weather injuries. So this next class is going to be focusing on shoulder and thoracic mobility, which often decline in colder months when activity levels change. So you'll learn how this impacts, swing mechanics in golf, overhead shots in pickleball, and even daily activities like reaching into a cabinet or shoveling snow. All right. So if you have any other questions, feel free to, email me here at paul@par5pt.com or team@betterspaces.com. All right. Thank you all for coming, and be well.